The book of the week from last week that I'll talk about tonight, it was quite a heavy one, a short but heavy one, The Blind Owl by Sadegh, Hedayat. This book was recommended to me by a colleague, Dr. Mitra Avariv, a psychologist, had her on the show when she discussed her book, The Divine Balance. And she mentioned this author to me, and so I actually had not read a novel. I've read a lot of poetry, Persian poets, but not a novel or novella by an Iranian writer, so wanted to do so. And as I mentioned, I was thinking about this book. It's the version I have is 78 pages long, and so you think in 78 pages, what can happen, or how can you be affected? And then you read it and you get very, very affected. It's a very intense novella, very dark, lots of just negative types of themes come throughout, but very beautifully written. I had the sense reading this, it was like you're getting dropped into someone's brain, something I felt when I was reading Marcel Proust's work as well, just the sense of you're diving into someone's brain. So even though they're telling you a story, but you feel so in their mind and how they're thinking and what's going on. It was written very, at times very simple, although of course as a translation there's always going to be some issues there. I might touch on that a bit. There was an introduction that talked a bit about the translation that I read. But, you know, you feel like you're just being placed in someone's brain and experiencing what it's like to think and feel like them. And I think great writers of fiction tend to do that. They give you the sense of being dropped into their brain and sensing things, seeing, feeling everything from their point of view. Sadegh Hedayat was born in 1903, and he took his own life in Paris in 1951 at the age of 48. And so, you know, even when I was announced that I was reading this book from a few people, I heard that when they were in Iran, they had heard things that his work is so dark, it's so depressing, that even it might drive people to suicide. Of course, his own suicide, and then the work being so dark. So I heard this from more than one person, this almost fear about, or this fear that was put into people that they should not read this book because of those risks. And it was very dark, and I could see that if you are in a fragile state, it probably isn't the best book to read. If you're feeling very down or in a dark place yourself, it might be more difficult. But I thought it was, I don't want to say enjoyable, especially the first read. I read about the book 1.5 times, which I'll explain. But it was very dark, and I felt lost in it sometimes. The book is written in a way where it's hard to at times tell what is reality and what is not. The narrator describes an experience, and there's lots of themes and motifs that repeat, even direct sentences that are repeated, and things happen that seem unrealistic, and you think at times he's having some kind of a hallucination. He talks about taking a large amount of opium, so is he having a hallucination? The two stories, or two parts of the book, are divided in such a way where it's almost like the same story or the same themes, but in a different way. In one, he's encountering this woman who isn't really quite a woman, but kind of seems like some kind of supernatural being, but has an interaction with her. And in the second part, it seems like this same woman is now his wife, but he actually hates her, and pardon my English, calls her a whore repeatedly, almost says, I don't want to call her my wife, because of how she's been towards him. And so it's interesting for me seeing these different dynamics, and people have written books analyzing this book, and written many commentaries on it. So you can read lots of, I would recommend reading the book itself, and then you can read people's commentaries to try to understand, because it is very written in a surreal way, in a way that has lots of layers and depth to it. It's not just a straightforward type of a read. But, you know, for me, some thoughts that were interesting was he talks about sharing thoughts with his shadow. And as I researched a bit about him, there was some speculation that, or I think it seemed that he had read some early psychoanalytic books, one or two by Freud, and maybe some others. And so it's more of a Jungian concept. I discussed it last week about the shadow, but these parts of ourself that we disown or put in the dark, not necessarily because they are bad, but because we've learned to disown them, or that it's safer not to be that way or to express those parts of ourself. So I wondered if times he's having these conversations with these different parts of himself, even the people he interacts with could be different parts of himself, because at times he becomes, there's this old man that he talks about at different parts in the book, but at one point he looks like that old man himself. So are there these different ways of being or parts of himself that are there, and the shadow it could be part of that as well. There's also, I guess this is kind of a spoiler, but he ends up, again, you don't know if it's real or fake or it's a hallucination or imagination, but he ends up killing his wife, stabbing her. And in the first part of the book, she dies in his presence, and he chops her up afterwards to be able to bury her. And so, as I was mentioning in the first part, she is this almost angelic figure that transfixes him, has such an impact on him. In the second part, she's such a negative person. Again, it seems like it's the same thing, same story, but in different versions or viewpoints. Reminded me of how we can idealize and devalue someone, the same person. And so depending on how we are seeing them, our perspective, the same person can be seen as either an angel or a devil, or either angel or whore in this case, who's impacting our life in a particular way. But you also, there's a lot of imagery about Iran, and I looked up some things, so that was nice for me, seeing Iran in ancient Persian history and more recent history, to try to understand some of the imagery that's in the book. As I also discovered, there's a lot of disagreement at times of what was meant. A book of this kind of complexity and written in such a opaque way at times, it's going to be hard to know exactly what was meant by the author to say this is definitely what he was implying. Many people, of course, have pointed to is there are suicidal themes in it as well. There's homicidal themes. When we consider his own suicide, was he himself tormented? When you read the book, you don't get the sense of someone who's having a good, positive experience. There's a lot of darkness in it. And so I read the book one time through. It's not very long, as I mentioned. And the first read through, I only read it halfway the second time, but the first read through, I felt very lost in it, which I think could be part of the experience, because you don't really know what's going on. Is this part of the hallucination? Who is he talking about exactly? There's even confusion in the story. Is his uncle or his father? If you read the book, you'll see why there's that confusion. They were identical twins. But there's a lot of confusion I had that actually made me feel almost uncomfortable. I realized as I was reading it, I wouldn't say it was making me down in a sense, but almost agitated in this sense of not sure what's going on. The themes were very dark. Lots of things were coming up that were negative. But I recognized I had this sense of apprehension, agitation. And when I finished the book, it had some sense of resolution that it was completed, and then I was trying to process it a bit and took some time. And then after about a day, I read the first segment again, and I realized I had such a different experience reading it that second time. Possibly knowing some of the elements of the second part, I'm not sure, but I felt more calm reading it. Possibly because I knew what was coming next to a degree. Kind of like if you're seeing a horror movie and you know now what's going to happen, it's a little bit less scary when things jump out or things happen, because you can anticipate them, whereas the first time you can't do so. I remember the movie The Joker, which came out, I think, about 3 years ago. I saw that movie twice, and the first time I remember this edge of my seat feeling of, what is he going to do? That was terrifying. That was very scary. And the second time, although it was still dark, I had less of that anxiety and agitation about what was going to happen next. So maybe that's what it was the second time around reading that first segment, although the first segment has some dark elements to it, but definitely it's lighter than the second part of the book, where he's in this horrible marriage with this woman who won't even consummate the marriage with him, but will be with many other men, and he is sickly and old and in ill health and not doing well. So the second part is definitely heavier and darker. So I'd like to actually read the second part and see if I still experience that part as more comfortable the second time around. But it was interesting for me as I read the first half. Again, it felt like a different book. It felt very different to me than the first time around, which was quite interesting. And so I should also mention, as I said, the translation of any kind of a foreign book, a book in a different language, we always have to be mindful that that's going to have an effect. And I would wonder, I would probably lose some of the words if I heard it in its original, but my Farsi is not good enough to read the book, but to listen to it in audio form, I was thinking about that, to see what that experience would be like. I'm sure so much is lost in translation. And this edition I have was translated by Navid Nouri, and it says it's based on the Bombay edition, and he explains in the introduction, which itself was about 20 pages, different aspects of different translations and how he believes there were some mistakes in earlier editions because of things that happened that he explains, and how things were transcribed and then printed and whatnot. But what was also interesting is he mentioned something called domestication versus foreignization in translation. And so domestication is when the translator makes the text a little bit more readable into the language, but they often have to change a lot to make it more readable in the language they're translating it into. And so we have more fluency, that's the emphasis. Whereas in foreignization, the emphasis is more on keeping the original source language and culture, even if it makes it a bit less fluent to read. And so he says that he chose foreignization more to try to keep as much as possible to the original. And at times to do that, he also would not translate certain words. So I can see if I can find one of those where it would have something. One of them was even things like osh, and then on the bottom would say like a soup that has regional different variations based on where you are. But there's places that, like things that were more historical, like monetary units that were used prior to the 20th century that might have indicated that there was some connection with history. Let's see if I can find one of those words here. But he tried not to translate words if he felt that you would lose something. Even Nowruz was left as Nowruz and then translated as to how it is, what it means. Or here we have Sadegh, which I actually have not heard, but a mirror that shows the reflection of a person as skinny, sallow, and unhealthy. So he decided to go for that more foreignization, which I actually thought would be good because I wanted to keep it as close to the original in the ways that you can preserve that, even if it's a little bit less fluent, meaning some of the words might not be the ones we use as commonly or might not read as smoothly in that sense. But anyway, I'm glad I read this book because from what I researched on Sadegh Hedayat, he's considered one of the great writers. I'm considering him the best writer, especially of the 20th century Iranian literature. And so to read a work of his for me was important. It was an interesting experience. That's how I describe the book. It's not that obviously I read a lot of nonfiction for the show. You're going to learn specific things like facts or information, but I had an experience reading it, and it was quite fascinating in that sense. So again, it's dark. If you're feeling in a lower state of being or lower state of mood, might not be the best book. It could have an effect on you. I wouldn't want to scare anyone in the sense of it's going to make you suicidal, as I was warned or people had mentioned to me. But nonetheless, it's a dark book, but I still found it fascinating, quite interesting. Again, that's The Blind Owl by Sadegh Hedayat. All right, let's go to a commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So in the first segment, I was talking about the book The Blind Owl by Sadegh Hedayat, and as I mentioned, he took his own life in 1951 at the age of 48. And so, I was thinking about suicide as I read the book, and afterwards, as I mentioned, people told me about those warnings and things that they had heard themselves. And in the book, you also see themes of exclusion, that he doesn't want to be this narrator part of the rabble, like the mess, the rest of people, or the main, I guess, how do you define rabble? I'm going to look it up just to make sure I'm getting it. It could be either a disorderly crowd, but it's usually ordinary people, which is how he seems to mean it. And the rabble comes up, that word, often. I don't know the original in Persian, but feeling excluded, feeling not part of. And so that can mean lots of things to me, as part of society being not good, and there's things about it that are bad, and you don't want to be part of that, or as part of being excluded, not being part of the accepted group or accepted people. And so often when we look at something like suicide, it can be related to not feeling accepted, not feeling like you are part of your group. Even some have argued that there could be some evolutionary understanding of it in that way, that why would we even have these types of thoughts, or why would they be there? I think we always have to be careful, because sometimes not everything we experience as humans is going to be productive or adaptive. There could be something that's related to something else that's positive in some way, but might have negatives. But nonetheless, thinking about suicide and talking about suicide are things that I try to keep in mind. Of course, as a therapist, we always have that in mind. We have that awareness that it is, if you want to call it the biggest hazard we can have, that we have to protect our clients against. It probably is that. And even when we discuss therapy, we begin therapy, we have to share the limits of confidentiality. So confidentiality is so vital to have a therapeutic alliance and relationship, that the client feels comfortable and safe, that the therapist will not share with anyone what they're talking about. Not only that, even the relationship of therapy can't be discussed, meaning that the therapist cannot even disclose that someone comes to them for therapy, let alone the contents of what they talk about. But in order to feel comfortable, although let me add something about that, of course, the contents even more, I think makes a lot of sense, but we can see that the stigma of seeing a therapist still is related to this. So I, of course, will always protect that confidentiality in the relationship, that a client is seeing me as confidential, absolutely. But I also know that some of it is related to the fact that we see therapy as such a thing that should be hidden, that we do that. Because I know medical doctors also have that type of confidentiality, but you see that people are much more comfortable with, that's my doctor, or even that kind of back and forth, because it's much more accepted, especially if it's your general practitioner. Well, of course, it's actually good you go get checkups and get seen. But with therapy, the relationship, even more that's the case. But nonetheless, that confidentiality is very, very vital and critical to having even the basis for therapy to begin, to have that type of a open, vulnerable dialogue. But we do tell clients that there are a few exceptions to confidentiality, and one of them is that if we felt that they were in danger of hurting themselves or others, so if they had suicidal or homicidal, not just thoughts, but actually we felt that there was a risk of taking action. And I could add this too, because this comes up a lot with clients, because we explain these limits of confidentiality, that I might have to intervene if you were to have, let's say, suicidal, if I thought you were to harm yourself. And so it can make people think that the association is, as soon as they say they've even thought about suicide, I push some button and the police, or some kind of emergency authorities show up at their door, which is not the case. So that, I hope that is something people are aware of. If you are in therapy, you can even, of course, ask your therapist, but not to think that even thinking about therapy or suicide, or saying it in some way, means that we'll break confidentiality instantly. It's really only if we feel that the client is at risk that we might have to. So it's really to protect the individual. And so suicide is front of mind. We mention in that when we establish confidentiality, but we always have it in mind, especially if a client is in some way going towards depression or is depressed, and we feel that sense, and we might even check in about it. So going back to this notion that it doesn't mean just because you have a suicidal thought that your therapist is going to break confidentiality, it's actually quite common for at some point in your life to have some level of suicidal thinking. So I'm not saying that means it's healthy for you to be suicidal or that you should feel that way, but then when you ask people if you ever even considered it in some degree, which I'll explain what that can mean, it's actually it's more common than you might think. And so I say that in case you're out there and you've ever thought about it and you think it means you're really bad or weird. You're not necessarily as you probably have more company than you realize. And that, of course, also means if you ever thought about it and you're even thinking about it more seriously, please seek out help. There's a lot of help out there. But I want us to normalize talking about it. So to not think that if you've ever had it cross your mind in any way that you shouldn't tell anyone because they'll think you're so different, because it's something that many people have thought about. So maybe here I can add some thoughts about when I say there's a range there, what that means. So suicidal thinking or ideation is on a spectrum of sorts. So, and sometimes it can be broken up into passive versus active types of way of looking at it, and also how serious it is. So passive suicidal ideation or suicidal thinking, that would be something like, gosh, if I didn't wake up tomorrow, I wouldn't mind. So it's still dark, it's still in a place that's concerning, or probably means the person is not feeling good about their life, about facing life, but they aren't thinking of actively taking their own life. There's just this, the will to live is not so strong that I love my life and I can't wait for tomorrow. There's a bit of this sense of impending doom of tomorrow. Can I face the day? Do I want to face the day? And so if I somehow didn't have to face tomorrow, I might feel okay or be okay with that. I wouldn't resist it as strongly. So that is in the passive type of suicidal ideation, which people might have at sometimes when we're feeling overwhelmed, feeling really down, feeling like there's too much to face, feeling like there's something coming up that we don't know if we can face it. All sorts of things might play into that type of thinking. But again, that's not something that likely will lead to some kind of need to break confidentiality, because it doesn't seem that the person is actually at risk, if that's the case. So that's on one end of the spectrum, or some thoughts about that in some even passive way. Oh, I've thought about it, or it came to my mind, that I can understand why people would want to do something, but I never would. So those types of things might come to people's mind. And then, of course, at the other far extreme is having an actual plan and intent to take action to take your own life, would be on the other extreme of that spectrum. And then, of course, there's everything in between that, with lots of different variations and ways of thinking and feeling that might affect how likely someone is to do that. And so as a therapist, we might do a suicide assessment, meaning we're trying to understand if a client has expressed any level of thinking in that direction. We might want to really assess to see where they are at and how comfortable we feel about them going forward, and let's say ending the session and feeling we'd feel okay that they're going to be okay. And even if you feel like they're okay and you don't want to break confidentiality, sometimes a therapist might increase sessions, increase communication or check-ins, come up with a plan with the client of things to do during that time to help them if they're in a lower place, of whether it's some coping skills, seeing people, talking to people, that they can do to help them during that time as well. And so the reason why I wanted to have this conversation, some of it might be informative, some of it might not be, but also just, I always think it's good to talk about a taboo topic to reinforce the mindset that it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to tell a loved one that you've thought about it, or it's come to your mind before, or that you're currently in that state. And I hope both people hearing this will feel more comfortable sharing it, but also if you're hearing it, that you'll be okay to hear it as well. That again, it is scary. We hear that word. I understand. It's a very loaded word, and as it should be. It is something very serious. But just because it's something serious doesn't mean we can't handle it, doesn't mean we can't talk about it. Because I can't tell you the number of times, whether it's professionally or just I've heard this or I've heard it from colleagues, that parents will say that their teenager somehow alluded to suicide, but the parents just said, oh, I think my kid was just saying something. And yes, people sometimes say certain things, and they might be saying something as a joke or in passing or in jest or to exaggerate how bad they feel or something. Those things are all possible, but people, of course, genuinely have those thoughts and feelings as well. And so I would always err on the conservative side, meaning that if someone says something in passing, I would rather be the one who misses what they mean and takes it seriously rather than to go the other way around. Because often what I have felt when people respond in that way is not just they've done a genuine assessment or they really are attuned with the person they're talking about. It's very often an act of denial, that it's so scary to think the possibility that our loved one, our child, or whoever it is considering suicide in any way, that we'd rather just pretend like it's not there and hope it goes away, or it's just something they said and it's not real, rather than take it seriously, because we also might feel ill-equipped. What does that even mean, taking it seriously? What do I do? If I open up that conversation, what am I supposed to do with what my child says, whatever that might be? So we'd rather avoid it. We tend to avoid things that make us feel uncomfortable, especially if we feel like we can't handle it. And so this could be one of those types of topics. And so what I would recommend is, let's say your child said it, oh, this happened, or if this happens, I'm going to kill myself, or something along those lines. If it's right that moment, let's say they go to their room or whatever it is, the next time you can, to just bring it up to them. Hey, you said this out there, and I just wanted to check in with you about that. And they might say, oh, I was just mad, I just yelled something, which is okay, and you can still explore it further. Like, okay, I just want you to know that I'm always here for you. I take that kind of a expression very seriously because I care about you, I love you, I want to make sure you're okay, and to me that's something serious. And so often people say, well, people might use that manipulatively, which can happen. I wouldn't go there first. Is it possible? Of course, people can use almost anything in that way as a way to emotionally hijack a situation. But still, I would err on the side of calling it out as real, because if they're using it in that manipulative way, you are making it more real by saying, okay, if you're going to say that, we're going to take action. So if you really are feeling that way, we might have to call an ambulance or take you to the hospital to make sure you're protected and you're safe. Because we don't want anyone to obviously use that as some kind of threat. Well, give me this, or I might be suicidal or something like that. So we say, okay, well, if you are, then we have to take action. We have to do something about it. So I would always err on the side of this is real. This is not manipulative. This is not just something as a joke or exaggerated or fake or a phase or something like that. Because what we do see is, yes, can I say we're going to prevent every suicide? I think that's possible, but I think, can we prevent many of them? Yes, definitely. Because we do see that there are signs and things people say to tell certain people, express in a certain way, that gives us some insight into that possibility. But too often we are afraid to go there, too afraid to have the conversation to even allow for us to be there for them. And being there for them doesn't mean you have to fix it all yourself. There are resources, whether you have to call an ambulance, call the pet team or whatever it is in your locality that will respond to psychiatric emergencies, or take the person to the hospital to make sure they are okay. There are things you can do. You don't have to do it all by yourself, but there are ways to help. But you can't help if you don't know the problem, or you don't really ask about the problem to see what it is. So I hope you will be bold when it comes to this topic. Suicide is something difficult to talk about. I totally can understand that. Even for me, I feel it every time I'm saying suicide here on the air. I do say it with its actual word and name to make it less and less taboo. But as a therapist who's been doing this for many years, it still is a charged word and a supercharged topic. So I understand that. But I hope we will recognize that it's so charged because it's something so serious and important and literally a matter of life and death. So we can be bold and try to embrace it and face that, or we can go away from it, recognizing that it could cost someone's life. I think the choice is easy, as lots of things are. It's simple, but doesn't mean it's easy to execute it, but it's an easy decision, and I hope we'll go towards that rather than away. All right, let's go to our last commercial break. We'll be right back.